Okay. File 10. I'm putting this down. I'm going to leave this here for about 5 minutes. If there's anything you want to say, any message you would like to share with the world, leave it on this recorder, and we will share it. Leaving now, closing the door. No one else is in this room at this time. Back into the room. I'm going to take the recorder. Thank you for your time.
Not all houses are homes. Some are prisons for the restless dead, places where pain and tragedy have etched themselves into the very walls. Tonight, we explore one such place, a house that seems innocent at first glance, but hides something far more sinister. Welcome to Sinister Secrets, where we uncover the truth behind the world's most chilling tales. This is the story of the Sallie House. The story of the Sallie House begins with a chilling tale of desperation and tragedy, a tale that has haunted Atchison, Kansas for over a century. It is said that in the late 1800s the house served a dual purpose, a family home on the upper floor and a medical practice on the ground floor. The doctor who lived and worked there, believed to be Charles Finney, was well respected in the community for his ability to handle emergencies. One fateful day, a young woman arrived at the house in a state of panic. In her arms, she carried her 6-year-old daughter, Sallie, who was writhing in pain and clutching her stomach. The child's face was pale and beads of sweat glistened on her forehead as she whimpered softly, her strength waning. The mother begged Dr. Finney for help, fearing the worst. Dr. Finney, after a quick examination, diagnosed Sallie with acute appendicitis, a condition that could prove fatal if not treated immediately. Surgery was the only option. Time was of the essence, and the doctor knew the appendix could rupture at any moment, spreading infection throughout the young girl's body. He assured the frantic mother that he would do everything he could to save her child. The small surgical room in the house was prepared in haste. A steel table, sterilized instruments, and a rudimentary anesthesia device were all that stood between Sallie and her potential salvation. The little girl, barely conscious, was placed on the table. Her wide, frightened eyes darted around the room searching for her mother, who was ushered out to spare her the traumatic sight of the operation. Dr. Finney began administering chloroform, the primary anesthetic of the time. Its effects were slow, and Sallie's breathing became shallow as she slipped into a dazed state. But in his haste, and fearing the child's condition would worsen, Dr. Finney made a critical decision. He began the operation before the anesthesia had fully taken effect. The scalpel made its first incision, and Sallie's eyes shot open. A blood-curdling scream tore through the house, reverberating off the walls. Her tiny body writhed in pain as the doctor worked frantically, his hands trembling under the weight of the moment. The child's cries were raw, filled with terror and agony, her voice hoarse from screaming. To her, the doctor was not a savior, but a tormentor, inflicting unimaginable pain. The mother, waiting just outside the room, heard her daughter's screams and collapsed to her knees in tears, clawing at the door as others tried to restrain her. Dr. Finney pressed on, desperate to complete the operation and save the girl's life. But it was too late. Sallie's small body went limp, her cries silenced forever. Her final moments were consumed by pain, fear, and betrayal, a trauma so profound that, according to legend, her spirit was bound to the house for eternity. Sallie's death cast a dark shadow over the house. Dr. Finney was said to be devastated, consumed by guilt and grief. Some accounts suggest he ceased practicing medicine shortly after the incident, his reputation marred by whispers of negligence and tragedy. The young mother left Atchison, her life shattered, and Sallie was buried in an unmarked grave, her name barely a memory. For years, the story of Sallie became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbours. But as time passed, the house took on a life of its own. Strange occurrences began to plague its inhabitants, leading many to believe that Sallie's restless spirit had never left. Was her haunting an act of vengeance, or was it a plea for justice and understanding? The true nature of her presence remains a mystery. But one thing is certain. Sallie's story has become inseparable from the house, her cries echoing through history as a chilling reminder of her tragic end. In the warm embrace of summer 1993, Tony and Deborah Pickman were filled with the kind of optimism that only expectant parents can know. Newly married and anticipating the arrival of their first child, they were on the hunt for the perfect home to begin their journey as a family. When they stumbled upon the quaint two-story house at 508 North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas, it felt like destiny. With its charming exterior, affordable rent, and ample space, the house seemed tailor-made for them. As they moved in, the Pickmans were captivated by the house's old-world charm. Hardwood floors creaked with character, and the vintage fixtures added a touch of nostalgia. Deborah imagined their child taking first steps across these floors, laughter filling the rooms. Tony was equally enthusiastic, eager to transform the house into a loving home. However, almost immediately, subtle anomalies began to surface, so subtle that at first they barely registered. On their first night, as they unpacked boxes in the living room, the overhead light flickered briefly. Tony glanced up, thinking it was a loose bulb. "I'll fix that tomorrow," he assured Deborah. She nodded, but couldn't shake a fleeting sense of unease. Over the following days, these minor oddities persisted. Light bulbs seemed to burn out more quickly than usual. Cold spots appeared in certain areas of the house, even though the summer heat was sweltering outside. Deborah occasionally felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone were watching her. She dismissed it as jitters from the move and the pregnancy. The nursery became Deborah's sanctuary. She spent hours painting the walls a soft pastel colour, assembling the crib, and arranging stuffed animals. One afternoon, she meticulously organised all the toys on a shelf before heading downstairs. Later that evening, when she returned to the nursery, she was puzzled to find a teddy bear lying in the middle of the floor. "Did you move the bear?" she called out to Tony. "I haven't been in there," he replied from the kitchen. Shrugging it off, she placed the bear back on the shelf. But the next morning, not only was the bear on the floor again, but all the toys were scattered across the room. More unsettling was the way they were arranged, in a perfect circle at the centre of the room. Deborah felt a chill despite the warm air. She rationalised that perhaps she had accidentally knocked them over, though deep down, the incident gnawed at her. The unease escalated when she began hearing faint whispers while in the nursery, a soft murmur that seemed to come from just beyond the walls. She pressed her ear against them, but heard nothing distinct. "It's just the house settling," Tony suggested when she mentioned it. "Old places make weird noises." One evening, while Tony was working late, Deborah decided to continue organising the nursery. As twilight faded to night, she became engrossed in sorting baby clothes. Suddenly, the room temperature plummeted. She could see her breath forming small clouds in front of her. The tiny hairs on her arms stood up, and an overwhelming sensation of being watched enveloped her. Turning slowly toward the doorway, Deborah's eyes widened in disbelief. Standing there was a little girl, no more than 6 years old. She had long brown hair that cascaded in loose curls over her shoulders and wore a delicate white dress that seemed antiquated, adorned with lace and ribbons. Her skin was porcelain pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and her eyes were a deep, penetrating blue that held both innocence and an inexplicable sadness. Deborah felt rooted to the spot, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The girl tilted her head slightly, as if curious, but remained silent. Deborah took a cautious step forward, and in that instant the girl vanished, disappearing like a wisp of smoke. The room was left in an eerie silence, the cold dissipating as quickly as it had come. Shaken, Deborah retreated from the nursery, her mind racing to make sense of what she'd seen. When Tony returned home, she recounted the encounter in vivid detail. He listened attentively but remained skeptical. "It was probably just a shadow or a trick of the light," he offered gently. "You've been under a lot of stress lately." "But she was so real," Deborah insisted. "I could see every detail of her dress, her hair, her eyes. She was just there. And then she wasn't." Tony wrapped his arms around her. "Maybe it's just your maternal instincts kicking into overdrive," he suggested. "Let's not worry about it." Despite his reassurances, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. Deborah began to dread entering the nursery. She started keeping the door closed, but it would often be found ajar, no matter how many times she shut it. Items continued to move on their own, keys misplaced, pictures tilted, lights turning on and off. The electrical anomalies couldn't be ignored, lamps flickered even after changing bulbs, and the television would switch channels by itself. One night, as they sat in the living room watching a movie, the stereo suddenly blasted static at full volume. Both jumped in surprise. Tony hurried to turn it off, but the power button was unresponsive. He had to unplug it from the wall to stop the noise. "That was weird," he muttered, a hint of concern creeping into his voice. Sleep became elusive. Deborah was plagued by nightmares of a little girl lost in darkness, calling out for help, but unable to find her. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of the girl's pleas lingering in her ears. Tony began experiencing insomnia, feeling restless and irritable without understanding why. Then came the night when Tony had his first inexplicable encounter. He had stayed up late, flipping through a magazine in the living room. The house was quiet, and Deborah had gone to bed hours earlier. Suddenly he felt a sharp sting on the back of his hand. Looking down, he saw 3 thin scratches forming, beads of blood surfacing on his skin. Startled, he searched for what might have caused it, a stray nail, a splinter, but found nothing. As he stood to go to the kitchen for a bandage, he caught a fleeting movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow darted past the doorway, too small to be an adult. "Deborah!" he called out, but remembered she was asleep upstairs. Gathering his courage, he stepped into the hallway. It was empty. The air felt thick, and a faint scent of roses, unexpected and out of place, wafted by. The next morning, Tony showed Deborah the scratches. "I can't explain it," he said, his tone uneasy. "I think maybe you're right. Something strange is happening here." They decided to reach out to the landlord, hoping for some answers. Hesitantly, he revealed that previous tenants had reported odd occurrences, but offered no specifics. Feeling a mix of fear and determination, the Pickmans began researching the history of the house. Their inquiries led them to stories of unexplained phenomena dating back decades, accounts of apparitions, objects moving on their own, and unsettling presences felt by those who lived there. The name Sallie surfaced repeatedly, tied to the legend of a young girl who had died tragically in the house long ago. Realizing they were not alone in their experiences, the Pickmans felt both relieved and more frightened than ever. The innocent home they had envisioned for their family was now a place of uncertainty and fear. As the paranormal activity intensified, they knew they had to take action, setting them on a path that would delve deeper into the sinister secrets of the Sallie House. As the days turned into weeks, the unsettling occurrences at the Sallie House evolved from curious anomalies to deeply disturbing phenomena. What began as flickering lights and shifting objects soon escalated into a full-blown haunting that consumed the lives of Tony and Deborah Pickman. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier with each passing day, as if the walls themselves were alive with malice. Late at night, when the world outside was still, the Pickmans began hearing sounds that had no logical explanation. It started with faint whispers, just barely audible, like fragments of a distant conversation. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud for a house with only 2 occupants. The footsteps often echoed through the upstairs hallway, stopping just outside their bedroom door. Each time, Tony would leap out of bed to investigate, only to find the corridor empty. Doors began to open and close on their own, sometimes with a gentle creak, other times with a violent slam that rattled the windows. Objects flew off shelves with startling force. Picture frames crashed to the floor, and once a vase shattered against the wall with no one nearby to throw it. Their dog, a loyal and gentle companion, became increasingly agitated. The animal would growl and bark at seemingly empty corners of the room, its eyes fixed on something Tony and Deborah couldn't see. One evening, after a particularly violent episode in which the dog cowered under the dining table, whimpering, it bolted out the front door and refused to return. The Pickmans were devastated but understood. Their beloved pet had sensed something far more dangerous than they could comprehend, while the entire family felt the presence in the house. It seemed to focus its wrath on Tony. He began to notice small, unexplained injuries, bruises on his arms, scratches on his back. At first, he dismissed them as accidental, the kind of marks one might get from moving furniture or working around the house. But the injuries grew more specific and more sinister. One night, Tony woke with a sharp burning pain across his chest. Gasping, he sat up and instinctively pulled his shirt away from his skin. Deborah, awakened by his sudden movements, turned on the bedside lamp and screamed. 3 long, bloody scratches stretched diagonally across Tony's chest, as if carved by claws. The wounds were fresh, glistening red, and as Deborah watched in horror, she swore she saw the scratches deepen before her eyes. "How is this happening?" she cried, rushing to grab a towel to staunch the bleeding. Tony, shaken and pale, could only shake his head. "I don't know," he whispered. The attacks didn't stop. On multiple occasions, Tony felt an invisible force shove him as he walked through the house. Once, as he climbed the stairs, he was pushed so hard that he stumbled, narrowly avoiding a fall. Burns appeared on his arms after brushing past what felt like ice-cold air. The assaults always seemed to happen when he was alone or when his guard was down, as if the entity was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One of the most terrifying moments occurred while Tony was in the kitchen late one evening. He had gone downstairs for a glass of water, hoping to shake off the oppressive feeling of being watched. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every small noise seem amplified. As he stood at the sink, he felt it, a sudden overwhelming presence behind him. The air grew thick, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. His skin prickled with cold sweat. Slowly he turned around, and out of the corner of his eye he saw it, a shadowy figure darting across the room. Before he could react, a deafening crash filled the air. Every cabinet door in the kitchen flew open simultaneously, slamming against their hinges with such force that a few broke loose. Plates and glasses tumbled out, shattering on the floor. The refrigerator door swung wide, spilling its contents. Tony staggered back, his heart pounding, unable to process what had just happened. Deborah rushed downstairs at the commotion, only to find Tony standing in the middle of the chaos, pale and trembling. "It was here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it. I felt it." Deborah, too, was not spared the horrors of the Sallie House. The nursery, once a place of joy and anticipation, became a focal point of her fear. She often heard the faint cries of a baby coming from the room, though their child had not yet been born. At first, she thought it was her imagination, perhaps an overactive maternal instinct, but the cries grew louder and more frequent until they were impossible to ignore. On several occasions, Deborah entered the nursery to find disturbing evidence of the unseen presence. Handprints would appear on the mirror above the dresser, small, childlike prints that didn't match her own or Tony's. Sometimes they were smudged as if something had pressed its palms against the glass and dragged them downward. Other times, the prints were perfectly formed, as though frozen in time. One particularly chilling night, Deborah awoke to find the nursery door slowly creaking open on its own. She called out for Tony, thinking he had gone to check on the room, but he was sound asleep beside her. Gathering her courage, she walked to the nursery, her heart racing with every step. When she pushed open the door, she found the rocking chair swaying gently back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. Her most vivid experience came one evening as she folded baby clothes. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, followed by a soft giggle. Spinning around, she saw nothing but the faint impression of tiny footprints in the carpet leading out of the room. As the haunting intensified, the Pickmans found themselves trapped in a waking nightmare. Sleep became impossible. The oppressive presence in the house seemed to grow stronger by the day, feeding on their fear and despair. They began to argue more frequently, their nerves frayed by the constant tension. Friends and family stopped visiting, unnerved by the strange happenings. The Pickmans had hoped to build a life of love and happiness in the house, but instead they found themselves living in terror. The entity, or entities, within the Sallie House seemed intent on driving them out. But the question remained, was this the work of Sallie, the restless spirit of a young girl? Or was there something far more sinister lurking in the shadows? The answer, as they would soon discover, was even more terrifying than they could have imagined. Desperate for answers and relief, Tony and Deborah Pickman reached out to a team of paranormal investigators, hoping to make sense of the escalating chaos within their home. The investigators arrived with an arsenal of tools: cameras, audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, and a psychic medium renowned for her sensitivity to spirits. As the team entered the Sallie House, the atmosphere seemed to shift immediately. The air grew heavy, and an oppressive silence fell over the space, as if the house itself was aware of their intrusion. The medium, a middle-aged woman named Elizabeth, moved through the house slowly, her eyes half closed as she concentrated on the energy around her. When she reached the nursery, she stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her chest as she gasped. "There's a child here," she murmured. "A little girl. Her name is Sallie." Elizabeth described Sallie as a confused, yet deeply emotional spirit. The little girl didn't seem to fully understand her own death, but was consumed by the lingering pain and betrayal she felt in her final moments. According to the medium, Sallie was drawn to Deborah, perhaps seeing her as a maternal figure who could provide the love and comfort she had been denied. "She likes you," Elizabeth told Deborah, "but she's very angry at men. She blames them for her suffering." The medium explained that Sallie's rage was likely rooted in her belief that the doctor who operated on her had intentionally caused her pain. In life, Sallie might not have fully comprehended the medical emergency or the necessity of the procedure. In death, this misunderstanding had solidified into a powerful resentment. Tony, as the man of the house, seemed to have become the target of this misplaced anger. Elizabeth went on to describe Sallie's dual nature. On one hand, she was a playful spirit. She enjoyed moving objects, rearranging toys, and even attempting to communicate through the flickering of lights. But this playful energy often gave way to moments of intense anger and frustration, especially when Tony was present. It was as though Sallie couldn't reconcile her feelings, swinging between childlike curiosity and a consuming fury. Deborah asked Elizabeth if Sallie meant them harm. "Not you," the medium replied carefully. "She doesn't hate you, Deborah. In fact, she feels safe around you. But Tony, she sees you as a threat. Her anger toward you isn't personal, it's tied to her trauma, but that doesn't mean she won't hurt you. Her emotions are too powerful for her to control." Tony, already uneasy, felt a chill run down his spine. The scratches, the shoves, the oppressive feelings, it all began to make sense. But as unsettling as this revelation was, the investigation would soon uncover something far darker than Sallie. As Elizabeth continued her walk through the house, her demeanor shifted. Her usually calm expression tightened, and she seemed hesitant to speak. In the living room, she stopped again, clutching her arms, as if warding off a sudden chill. "There's something else here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something much darker." The investigators exchanged uneasy glances as Elizabeth explained what she was sensing. This entity, she said, wasn't human. It was a malevolent force, ancient and powerful, that thrived on fear and chaos. Unlike Sallie, who was tethered to the house by her tragic death, this darker presence seemed to have been drawn to the house over time, feeding off the negative energy created by Sallie's rage and the Pickman's terror. Elizabeth warned that this entity might be using Sallie's spirit as a mask, hiding its true intentions behind the image of an innocent child. "It's clever," she said. "It wants you to focus on Sallie because she's relatable, sympathetic. But it's the darkness behind her you need to worry about." During the investigation, the team set up audio and video equipment throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal activity. What they recorded was chilling. On multiple occasions, faint voices were picked up, including what sounded like a child's laughter mixed with soft crying. In one particularly eerie session, a deep guttural growl was captured in the living room, an unmistakable sign of a malevolent presence, according to the investigators. Electromagnetic field detectors spiked erratically, especially in the nursery and the basement, areas Elizabeth identified as hotspots for the darker entity. Thermal cameras picked up unexplained cold patches, and one camera positioned in the kitchen recorded a chair moving several feet across the floor on its own. At the end of the investigation, Elizabeth and the team sat down with Tony and Deborah to discuss their findings. The medium explained that while Sallie was the most active spirit in the house, she was not the source of the most dangerous activity. The darker entity is opportunistic, Elizabeth warned. It's using Sallie's energy to amplify its presence. The more afraid you are, the stronger it becomes. If you stay here, it will continue to escalate. The investigators suggested several possible courses of action, including blessing the house, bringing in a priest for an exorcism, or even moving out entirely. Tony and Deborah were conflicted. On one hand, they didn't want to abandon their home. On the other, the thought of continuing to live under such oppressive conditions was unbearable. Before leaving, Elizabeth turned to Deborah. Whatever you decide, remember this. Sallie is not your enemy. She's a child, lost and scared. But the thing behind her, that's what you need to fear. The investigation left the Pickmans with more questions than answers. Who or what was this darker presence? And how had it come to the house? Was it truly feeding on Sallie's energy? Or was it the source of her torment as well? And most importantly, how could they protect themselves and their unborn child from forces they couldn't see or control? As they sat in their living room that night, surrounded by the eerie stillness of the house, Tony and Deborah realized they were no longer just living in a haunted home. They were part of a much larger and more sinister story, one that would continue to unfold in ways they could never predict. The darkness had revealed itself, and it was not going to let them go easily. As the months dragged on, the haunting in the Sallie House took an even darker turn. What began as unsettling but tolerable experiences escalated into a relentless assault on Tony and Deborah Pickman's lives. The unseen entities in the house seemed to grow bolder and more aggressive, feeding off the couple's fear and despair. Tony, already the primary target of the house's malicious energy, became increasingly withdrawn. Once a jovial and optimistic man, he now walked through the house with a perpetual look of unease. He began to avoid certain rooms entirely, especially the nursery and the basement, claiming he felt an overwhelming sense of dread whenever he entered them. At night, his sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares of shadowy figures looming over him, whispering unintelligible words that left him waking in cold sweats. During the day, Tony's paranoia grew. He often felt as though he was being watched, even when he was alone. On several occasions, he caught fleeting glimpses of a dark, shadowy figure out of the corner of his eye, always just beyond his line of sight. The feeling of being hunted followed him everywhere, even outside the house. Tony confided in Deborah that he sometimes felt like the entity was inside his head, planting thoughts of anger and despair that weren't his own. Deborah, now deeply worried for her husband's safety, became his anchor. She tried to reassure him, encouraging him to focus on their soon-to-be-born child. But even her optimism was waning. She had seen too much to deny the malevolence of the house, and Tony's transformation terrified her. The physical attacks on Tony intensified. One afternoon, as he sat in the living room attempting to read, he felt a sharp pain in his arm. Looking down, he saw fresh scratches forming, as though an invisible hand were clawing at his skin. The wounds were deep enough to bleed, and Deborah, rushing to his side, stared in horror as the scratches continued to appear right before her eyes. "It's like it's marking me," Tony muttered, his voice trembling. The house seemed to delight in tormenting him. Objects were frequently thrown in his direction. Picture frames, books, even a small lamp once flew across the room, narrowly missing his head. One particularly horrifying incident occurred when a Tony entered the kitchen to find all the knives from the drawer arranged on the counter, their blades pointing directly at him. Deborah's screams from the next room broke his trance-like state, and he rushed out, leaving the ominous display untouched. While Tony bore the brunt of the haunting, Deborah was not spared. Her maternal instincts to protect her unborn child clashed with the terror that gripped her every time she walked through the house. The nursery, once a symbol of hope and joy, had become a place she avoided at all costs. She could no longer enter the room without feeling cold air wrapping around her like icy fingers, or hearing faint, sorrowful cries that seemed to echo from another world. The rocking chair in the nursery often moved on its own, creaking rhythmically, as if an invisible occupant were sitting there. On one occasion, Deborah found the crib's mobile spinning violently, though no windows were open and the air was still. What unnerved her most were the messages, scrawled faintly on mirrors or windows in condensation, were childlike phrases like, "Play with me and go away." The latter appeared most often near Tony's belongings. Deborah feared for her husband, but she also feared for her child. She began to feel that the house didn't just want to hurt Tony, it wanted to consume them all. The breaking point came one evening when Tony was attacked in the living room. It started innocuously enough. Tony was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the television, trying to distract himself from the suffocating tension that had become his constant companion. Deborah was upstairs, folding laundry, when she heard him yell. She rushed downstairs to find Tony pinned to the couch, his arms pressed against his sides as if by invisible hands. His face was twisted in terror, and his breathing was shallow. "I can't move," he gasped, his eyes wide with panic. Deborah ran to him, grabbing his arms and trying to pull him up, but he remained stuck, as though a tremendous weight held him down. Suddenly, Tony was lifted slightly and then thrown to the floor with a violent force that left him gasping for air. Deborah screamed, kneeling beside him as he clutched his chest. "It's trying to kill me," he whispered, his voice shaking. This attack was unlike anything they had experienced before. The entity was no longer content with scaring them. It was attempting to harm them in ways that could no longer be ignored. Deborah helped Tony to his feet, and the two sat in silence, too terrified to speak. The Pickmans knew they couldn't stay in the house any longer. They had hoped to endure the haunting, believing it might fade with time, but it had only grown stronger. With Deborah's due date fast approaching, the thought of bringing a child into such a dangerous environment was unthinkable. The next morning they made the decision to leave. Packing their belongings was an exercise in fear, as objects continued to move on their own, doors slammed shut behind them, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. Even as they loaded their car, the house seemed to resist their departure. The air inside grew colder, the whispers louder, as if the entities were protesting their escape. Finally, with their car packed and the door locked behind them, the Pickmans drove away from the Sallie House, never to return. Leaving the house didn't immediately bring peace. Tony continued to experience nightmares, often waking in the middle of the night convinced that the entity had followed them. Deborah, too, struggled to shake the feeling of being watched, even in their new home. Over time, however, the couple began to heal, focusing on their new role as parents and putting the horrors of the Sallie House behind them. The Sallie House, meanwhile, remained a beacon for darkness. It was left empty, but its reputation grew. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and skeptics alike flocked to the property, each hoping to capture a glimpse of the malevolent forces that had driven the Pickmans away. The house, with its unassuming exterior and deeply haunted interior, became infamous as one of America's most haunted locations, a place where fear lived and thrived. For the Pickmans, it was a chapter of their lives they wished to forget, but for the world, their story was a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk unseen. The Sallie House wasn't just haunted, it was a house of malevolence, a place where no one, not even the innocent, was safe. After the Pickmans fled the Sallie House, leaving behind their dreams of a perfect family home, the story of their harrowing experiences began to spread. The small, unassuming house in Atchison, Kansas, became infamous almost overnight, drawing paranormal enthusiasts, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers from all corners of the country. With its reputation cemented as one of the most haunted locations in America, the Sallie House was no longer just a home, it was a symbol of the unknown. Word of the haunting attracted teams of paranormal investigators, eager to uncover the truth. Equipped with the latest ghost hunting technology, these teams set out to document the strange phenomena within the house. Their findings often aligned with the Pickman's accounts. Cold spots, unexplained noises, and sudden changes in temperature were common occurrences. Electromagnetic field detectors frequently spiked in areas of the house, particularly the nursery and the basement. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came from thermal cameras, which captured unexplained heat signatures resembling human figures. Shadowy forms were often seen darting across hallways or lingering in corners, only to vanish when approached. Audio recordings revealed disembodied voices, sometimes faint whispers, other times clear phrases like, "Get out," or "Help me." Visitors who dared to spend the night reported being woken by loud banging noises, the sound of footsteps pacing the hallways, or the sensation of someone or something pulling at their blankets. Many claimed to see the apparition of a little girl with long brown hair and a white dress, often standing silently in the nursery or near the stairs. Her expression, they said, was one of sadness, but her presence was anything but comforting. Some visitors experienced more physical manifestations. Guests reported being scratched, shoved, or feeling an oppressive weight pressing down on their chests as they tried to sleep. One investigator even claimed to have been bitten on the back of their neck by an unseen force. The physical attacks, eerily reminiscent of what Tony endured, only deepened the house's terrifying reputation. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed to explain the haunting. Some paranormal experts believe Sallie's spirit is at the center of the activity. They describe her as a restless ghost trapped in the house by the trauma of her death. According to this theory, Sallie's playful yet volatile nature reflects the emotional turmoil of a child who doesn't fully understand what happened to her. Other investigators, however, suggest that Sallie is not the only presence in the house, or even the most significant one. They argue that the house may be a portal, a site where the barrier between the physical world and the spirit realm is unusually thin. This could explain why so many different types of activity are reported, from benign interactions to outright malevolent attacks. Some have linked the darker presence in the house to the land itself, theorizing that it could have a history of violence or tragedy predating the house's construction. Skeptics, meanwhile, offer more grounded explanations. They attribute the phenomena to natural causes, such as drafts, electromagnetic fields from old wiring, or the power of suggestion amplified by the house's reputation. They argue that the Pickman's experiences, while genuinely terrifying to them, could have been influenced by stress, sleep deprivation, and the psychological effects of expecting a child in a new home. But for those who have stepped inside the Sallie House, skepticism often dissolves into belief. The sheer consistency of reports, spanning decades and involving countless witnesses, makes it hard to dismiss the haunting as mere imagination. The Sallie House's infamy only grew as it became the subject of television shows, documentaries, and paranormal podcasts. It was featured on programs like Sightings and A Haunting, where the Pickmans shared their story in vivid detail. These shows often dramatized the events, introducing the Sallie House to a global audience and sparking debates about the nature of the paranormal. Books were written recounting the chilling tales of those who dared to investigate the house. Podcasts and YouTube channels analyzed the case, with some hosts spending nights in the house to document their experiences. The story even inspired fictional adaptations, further embedding the Sallie House in pop culture as a symbol of supernatural terror. Today, the Sallie House stands as both a tourist attraction and a beacon for those fascinated by the paranormal. It remains unoccupied, though its doors are open for daytime tours and overnight stays. Paranormal enthusiasts flock to the property, eager to experience its mysteries firsthand. Some leave with only stories of creaking floors and eerie vibes, while others claim life-altering encounters with the supernatural. The house's exterior, modest and unassuming, betrays none of the horrors within. Yet those who enter describe an immediate sense of foreboding, as if the house itself is alive and watching. Many report an overwhelming heaviness, a pressure on their chest that makes it hard to breathe. Others hear whispers calling their names, or feel unseen hands brushing against their skin. Despite the ongoing investigations and personal accounts, the true nature of the Sallie House remains a mystery. Is Sallie's spirit truly a child in need of closure, or is she a mask for something far more sinister? Are the house's energies tied to its tragic past, or does the land harbour secrets older than the structure itself? The questions linger, unanswered. For the Pickmans, the Sallie House was a chapter of their lives they wish they could forget. Even years later, they admit that the haunting left an indelible mark on their psyches. Tony still struggles with the occasional nightmare, and Deborah avoids talking about the house in detail, fearing that revisiting the memories might invite the darkness back into their lives. But for the rest of the world, the Sallie House remains a chilling reminder of what might lie beyond the veil of the known. It is a place where fear takes form, where shadows hold secrets, and where the past refuses to rest. Is the Sallie House truly haunted, or is it merely a product of fear, folklore, and suggestion? The answer may never be known, but one thing is certain: those who step through its doors leave forever changed. The story of the Sallie House reminds us that some places are more than just bricks and mortar. They hold echoes of the past, moments of fear, pain, and sorrow that refuse to fade. Whether Sallie was truly a restless spirit or something far more sinister lurked in the shadows, one thing is certain: the house continues to captivate and terrify all who dare to enter. It stands as a chilling reminder that there are mysteries in this world we may never fully understand. Here on Sinister Secrets, our journey into the eerie and unexplainable is far from over. The Sallie House is just one of many dark tales waiting to be uncovered, places where history and horror collide, and where the truth is often stranger than fiction. If stories like this resonate with you, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds and brave souls who aren't afraid to confront the unknown. What are your thoughts on the Sallie House? Is it haunted by the spirit of a young girl? Or is there a darker force pulling the strings? Do you think the Pickman's experiences were real? Or could they have been the result of something else entirely? Let me know your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take on this chilling tale. If you have a personal story of your own or a haunting suggestion for a future episode, reach out. Every voice, every encounter, and every theory helps us uncover more of the shadows that surround us. Thank you for joining me tonight, and remember, stay curious, stay cautious, and always keep your lights on. This is Sinister Secrets, where we confront the darkness and bring its mysteries to light. Until next time, sweet dreams, if you can sleep.